A black woman marries a wealthy lawyer. Her family turns their back on her, but what happens years later will shock them all. Dear family of Mr. Peter Stories, I know you've been eagerly waiting for another tale, and trust me, this one is going to be extra special, crafted just for you. Get ready to dive into an adventure filled with excitement and joy. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the love and magic we share in these stories. Stay tuned with love, Mr. Peter Stories. The autumn wind whispered through Chicago's towering skyscrapers as Gaynell Blossom traced her fingers over the embossed wedding invitation. The heavy cardstock felt like a weight in her hands. Not just paper, but 5 years of family history, heartache and hope compressed into a single elegant rectangle. Her sister Alessia's flowing script danced across the page, each curve a reminder of childhood memories and shared secrets now shrouded in years of silence. From her penthouse apartment's floor-to-ceiling windows, Gaynell could see the legal aid clinic where her life had changed forever. It sat nestled between gleaming corporate towers, a humble brick building that served as a bridge between two worlds, her past and her present, privilege and poverty, love and loss. The morning sun caught the windows, making them shine like the diamond on her finger, the ring that had sparked so much controversy. She remembered that spring morning as if it were yesterday. The clinic had been bustling with its usual morning chaos, single mothers seeking custody assistance, elderly residents fighting eviction notices, young dreamers hoping to navigate immigration paperwork. Gaynell had just finished her usual Tuesday morning intake interviews, her social work degree and natural empathy making her a favorite among the clinic's clients. The door had opened, bringing with it a gust of warm air and the man who would change her life. Lavender Bartholomew III, with his Brooks Brothers suit and leather briefcase that probably cost more than her monthly rent, seemed comically out of place among the clinic's worn furniture and outdated computers. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, kind, determined, and carrying none of the condescension she'd come to expect from corporate lawyers venturing into their world of public interest law. "I'm looking for Ms. Blossom," he'd said, his voice carrying the polish of private schools, but touched with genuine warmth. "I heard she's the person to talk to about expanding our firm's pro bono program." Their first conversation lasted 3 hours, long after the clinic had closed for the day. They talked about justice, about the broken systems they were both trying to fix from different angles. He shared stories of his grandmother, who had raised him with tales of her own struggles as a civil rights activist in the 1960s. She told him about growing up on the South Side, watching her parents work multiple jobs to send her and Alessia to college, their sacrifice fueling her determination to give back to her community. When he asked her to dinner that evening, Gaynell hesitated. She'd seen too many well-meaning white lawyers treat the clinic like a safari experience, a chance to observe poverty up close before retreating to their comfortable lives. But something in Lavender's expression, earnest, almost vulnerable, made her say yes. Their first date was not at some exclusive restaurant as she'd expected, but at a small Ethiopian place near the clinic. Lavender admitted he'd asked her colleagues for recommendations, wanting to meet her in a place where she felt comfortable. They shared injera and stories, discovering shared passions for social justice, literature, and jazz. He spoke about his plans to reform his firm's hiring practices, to create pipelines for diverse candidates from underprivileged backgrounds. She challenged his assumptions, pushed back against his blind spots, and found herself increasingly impressed by his willingness to listen and learn. As weeks turned into months, their relationship deepened. Lavender became a regular at community events, rolling up his sleeves at neighborhood cleanups and attending local school board meetings. He never tried to save her world. Instead, he joined it, learned from it, and used his privilege to amplify rather than overshadow the voices of those already doing the work. But paradise found its serpent when the time came to tell her family. The dinner at her parents' house started tense and ended in disaster. Her father, a man who'd faced discrimination his entire life, couldn't see past Lavender's background. Her mother, usually the family peacemaker, sat in uncomfortable silence. And Alessia, her beloved sister and best friend, launched into a scathing critique of gentrification and cultural tourism. "He's just another rich white boy playing savior," Alessia had spat, her words cutting deeper because they echoed Gaynell's own initial fears. "You really think he sees you as an equal? That his family will ever accept you as anything more than their son's interesting experiment?" The argument that followed reopened generations of wounds about respectability politics, about what success should look like for a black woman from the South Side, about loyalty and privilege and the complex dance between assimilation and authenticity. Gaynell left her childhood home that night with tears streaming down her face, Lavender's hand steady on her back as they walked to his car through the neighborhood where she'd grown up. In the months that followed, every attempt at reconciliation seemed to make things worse. Her parents' silence felt like judgment. Alessia's pointed social media posts about selling out and forgetting where you came from stung like physical blows. Even their engagement announcement was met with a cold email from her mother. "We hope you know what you're doing." The wedding planning became an exercise in grief management. Each empty RSVP from a family member carved new holes in her heart. Lavender offered to reach out himself, to try to bridge the gap, but Gaynell knew this was something her family had to work through on their own. His own parents, though initially surprised by their relationship, had welcomed her warmly, particularly his mother, who recognized in Gaynell the same fire for justice that had driven her own mother's civil rights work. Their wedding day dawned bright and clear, the garden venue perfumed with roses and possibility. Gaynell stood before the mirror in her designer dress, simple, elegant, and purchased from a black-owned bridal boutique, and felt the weight of absence. No mother to adjust her veil, no sister to hold her bouquet, no father to walk her down the aisle. But when she saw Lavender waiting for her beneath the flower-covered arch, his eyes shining with tears and promise, she knew with unshakable certainty that she was making the right choice. They built their life together thoughtfully, intentionally. The penthouse apartment came with a spare bedroom that they converted into a community meeting space, hosting gatherings for local activists and organizing sessions for grassroots campaigns. Their dinner parties brought together corporate lawyers and community organizers, creating connections that turned into mentorship programs and funding opportunities. Together, they established a foundation that provided not just scholarships, but comprehensive support systems for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, 5 years later, Gaynell stood in that same apartment holding her sister's wedding invitation. The path to reconciliation had been slow, marked by small steps and careful conversations. It began with Alessia, who had swallowed her pride to admit she had judged too quickly and loved too conditionally. Their parents followed gradually, first accepting phone calls, then short visits, and finally acknowledging that their daughter's choice had been not a betrayal, but an expansion of family, of possibility, of love itself. As she carefully placed the invitation on her marble countertop, Gaynell felt the warmth of tears on her cheeks. They were not tears of sadness, but of gratitude, for love that persisted, for family that grew, for bridges that could be rebuilt. In the distance, the legal aid clinic caught the morning light, a reminder that sometimes the greatest journeys begin in the most unexpected places. The sound of keys in the door announced Lavender's return from his morning court appearance. He would be wearing one of his perfectly tailored suits, but his tie would be loosened, a small rebellion against corporate uniformity that always made her smile. Soon they would begin preparing for Alessia's wedding, where they would stand together as family, their love a testament to the power of choosing hope over fear, growth over comfort, and forgiveness over pride. And as the door opened, Gaynell smiled, knowing that their story of love crossing boundaries, of family transcending prejudice, of hearts growing large enough to hold both past and future, was still being written, each day adding new chapters of understanding, reconciliation, and joy. The first meeting, the downtown legal aid clinic, sat at the intersection of two Chicagos, one of gleaming glass towers and corporate power, the other of resilient communities and grassroots strength. It was mid-April, and the morning sun painted golden rectangles on the clinic's worn linoleum floors, through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned since the previous administration. Gaynell Blossom moved through the waiting room with practiced grace, her natural hair styled in a crown of twists, wearing a thrifted blazer that she'd had tailored to perfection, a small luxury she allowed herself on her social worker's salary. The morning had started like any other Tuesday. Ms. Rodriguez was there again, clutching documents about her landlord's latest attempt to evict her family. Mr. Washington needed help appealing his disability denial. 3 new faces sat anxiously with manila folders in their laps, eyes following Gaynell as she organized intake forms and started the ancient coffee maker that served as the clinic's heartbeat. "Good morning, everyone," she called out, her voice carrying the warmth that had made her the clinic's most requested counselor. "We'll start intake interviews in about 15 minutes. Please make sure your forms are filled out completely. Don't worry if English isn't your first language, we can help with translation." The coffee maker sputtered and wheezed, filling the room with the aroma of generic brand coffee when the door chimed. Gaynell looked up, expecting another client, but instead found herself staring at a man who seemed to have stepped out of a different world entirely. Lavender Bartholomew III, though she wouldn't learn his full name until later, stood in the doorway like a Renaissance painting dropped into a documentary. His charcoal grey suit was clearly bespoke, the fabric catching the light in a way that suggested Italian wool. His Oxfords gleamed despite the city's spring mud, and his leather briefcase bore the subtle patina of exceptional quality, aged to perfection. But it was his expression that caught and held her attention. There was none of the savior complex she'd come to expect from wealthy visitors to the clinic, none of the condescending benevolence that usually accompanied pro bono announcements. Instead, his face held something she would later recognize as nervous determination. He shifted his weight slightly, green eyes scanning the room before landing on her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the precise diction of private schools, but softened by what sounded like a hint of Louisiana in his vowels. "I'm looking for Ms. Gaynell Blossom." "You found her," Gaynell replied, unconsciously straightening her blazer. "And you are?" "Lavender Bartholomew from Whitworth, Sterling and Blake." He stepped forward, offering his hand. His handshake was firm, but not domineering, a detail she would remember later when analyzing every moment of this first meeting. "I was hoping to discuss expanding our firm's pro bono program with your clinic." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they stood there, hands clasped a moment longer than strictly professional. Gaynell felt the weight of her client's eyes on them, this tableau of contrast. Her brown skin against his pale hand, her carefully budgeted outfit against his clear display of wealth, her world intersecting with his in this liminal space of justice and need. "Of course," she said, withdrawing her hand and gesturing toward her office, "though I should warn you, if you're looking for easy PR cases, we might not be the best fit." His laugh surprised her, genuine, unguarded, almost musical. "Actually, I'm hoping for the opposite. We have too many associates doing surface-level pro bono work. I want to develop a program with real impact, real commitment." He followed her into her small office, ducking slightly under the low doorframe. "My grandmother would have called it putting your money where your mouth is." Gaynell's office was a testament to organized chaos, Case files stacked in precise towers, walls covered in community resources, and children's artwork from grateful clients. A desk that had seen at least 3 decades of service. She gestured to the chair across from her desk, noting with interest how Lavender sat, without first checking for dust or dirt. A small detail that spoke volumes. "Your grandmother sounds wise," she said, taking her own seat. "Tell me more about her." What followed was not the meeting either of them had expected. Lavender spoke about his grandmother, Martha Bartholomew, who had marched in Selma and spent her life teaching in Louisiana public schools. He described Sunday dinners, where she would quiz him on civil rights history between courses, her insistence that privilege came with responsibility, her disappointment when he chose corporate law. "But," he said, leaning forward with an intensity that made the cheap office chair creak, "I think I finally understand what she meant about working from the inside. The system needs people fighting from all angles, grassroots organizers, public interest lawyers, and yes, corporate attorneys who can leverage resources and influence." Gaynell found herself sharing too, about growing up on the South Side, watching her parents work multiple jobs to keep them in good schools. About the high school guidance counselor who told her to aim lower when she talked about college dreams. About the scholarship that got her through school and her determination to help create those opportunities for others. The morning slipped into afternoon. Clients came and went, handled by other staff members as Gaynell and Lavender's. Conversation expanded beyond pro bono programs into discussions of systemic change, educational equity, and the complex dance of maintaining cultural identity while navigating predominantly white institutions. "I should let you get back to your clients," Lavender said finally, noticing the lengthening shadows. He stood smoothing his suit with an unconscious gesture, then seemed to make a decision. "But I'd like to continue this conversation. Would you be interested in dinner?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Gaynell thought about all the reasons to say no, the professional complications, the cultural gaps, the potential for misunderstanding or worse. She thought about Alessia's voice in her head, warning about men who fetishized black women, about the dangers of crossing class lines, about staying true to their roots. But she also thought about the way he had listened, really listened, during their conversation. How he had challenged some of her assumptions even as she challenged his. How his eyes lit up when talking about his grandmother's activism, and how his suggestions for the pro bono program showed genuine understanding of community needs. "On one condition," she said, rising from her desk. "No Michelin stars, no expense accounts. I know a place on 47th Street that serves the best jollof rice in Chicago." His smile then, surprised, delighted, a touch relieved, would become one of her favorite memories of that day. "I'd like that," he said, "though I should warn you, my spice tolerance is embarrassingly low." "Don't worry," she laughed. "We'll build up your tolerance slowly, just like we'll build this pro bono program, one step at a time, with intention and understanding." As they exchanged numbers and made plans for dinner, neither could have known they were writing the first lines of an epic love story. They couldn't have predicted the family tensions, the societal pressures, the journey of growth and understanding that lay ahead. All they knew in that moment was that something significant had shifted, like the first tremor before an earthquake, promising to reshape the landscape of their lives in ways both challenging and beautiful. Outside the clinic's windows, Chicago continued its eternal dance of contrast and convergence. The evening sun painted the scene in shades of possibility, touching both the corporate towers and the community centers, the luxury condos and the public housing, the separate worlds that Gaynell and Lavender would soon begin to bridge, not just through their work, but through their love. As Lavender left the clinic that evening, his polished shoes clicking against the cracked sidewalk, Gaynell watched him go and felt the weight of future possibilities settling around her shoulders. She didn't know then that this was the beginning of a love story that would challenge prejudices, heal family wounds, and prove that the greatest transformations often start in the most unexpected places, on the most ordinary of Tuesday mornings, in a legal aid clinic where two worlds collided and found, in their collision, something beautiful and new. Later that night, as she recounted the day in her journal, Gaynell wrote words that would prove prophetic. Met someone today who feels like a beginning. Not sure yet if it's the beginning of a great love story or a cautionary tale. Maybe those are sometimes the same thing, but for the first time in a long time, I'm curious to find out. Family tensions rise. The evening Gaynell chose to introduce Lavender to her family was heavy with Chicago summer humidity, the kind that made the air feel like warm molasses. Her childhood home in Bronzeville stood proud among its neighbors, a two-story brownstone that her parents had purchased 30 years ago, back when the neighborhood was considered undesirable by real estate agents, who now couldn't stop talking about its upcoming status. Gaynell sat in Lavender's Tesla, parked across the street, gathering courage. Through the living room windows, she could see her mother's prized African violet collection lining the windowsills, their purple blooms a testament to decades of careful tending. Her sister Alessia's car was already parked in the driveway, a used Camry she'd bought with her first year's teaching salary, a point of pride she never failed to mention. "We don't have to do this tonight," Lavender said softly, his hand finding hers across the center console. "We could wait, give them more time to get used to the idea." Gaynell shook her head, the gold beads in her braids catching the evening light. "They've had 3 months of knowing I'm dating someone. If we wait any longer, Mama's going to show up at the clinic with a casserole and 1,000 questions." She squeezed his hand. "Just remember what I told you about my father." James Blossom had worked maintenance at the University of Chicago for 40 years, keeping the gleaming halls of privilege clean while putting 2 daughters through college. He'd faced every indignity the world could throw at a black man with quiet dignity and contained rage, teaching his daughters to be twice as good, twice as strong, twice as everything. The thought of him meeting Lavender, whose family name graced one of the university's newer buildings, made Gaynell's stomach twist. They walked up the worn concrete steps, past the potted tomato plants that were her mother's latest passion project. Gaynell's key still worked. Some things never changed. But she rang the doorbell anyway. The chime had barely faded when the door flew open. Alessia stood there, her teacher's eyes taking in every detail of Lavender's appearance. Her sister had always been the more overtly political one, the one who quoted Malcolm X at family dinners and organized Black Student Union protests in college. Now she taught African American history at their old high school, determined to give their community's children the education they deserved. "So," Alessia said, her voice carrying a sharp edge beneath its sweetness, "you're the one my sister's been too busy to call about." "Alessia," Gaynell warned, but Lavender stepped forward with his hand extended. "Lavender Bartholomew," he said. "I've heard wonderful things about your work with the student activism program." Alessia's handshake was brief, professional. "Funny, I haven't heard anything about you except that you're a lawyer. Corporate, right? The kind that helps companies find loopholes to avoid hiring people who look like us." "Actually," Lavender began, but was interrupted by Marion Blossom's appearance in the hallway, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "Lord, Alessia, let them at least get in the door before you start the interrogation," Gaynell's mother said, though her own smile seemed strained. Come in. Dinner's almost ready." The living room was exactly as Gaynell remembered, photos covering every wall chronicling 4 generations of black excellence and perseverance. Her great-grandmother's Bible on the coffee table, the worn but well-maintained furniture that had hosted countless family gatherings. But tonight, the familiar space felt charged with tension. James Blossom rose from his armchair, slowly, deliberately. He was still tall, still carried himself with the straight-back dignity that no amount of manual labor had been able to bend. His eyes met Lavender's with an intensity that made the younger man's law-firm confidence falter slightly. "Mr. Blossom," Lavender said, "thank you for having me in your home." James replied, not offering his hand. "So you're the one who's been taking my daughter to all those fancy restaurants downtown?" "Actually, sir, Gaynell's been introducing me to places I never knew existed. Last week she took me to Ms. T's Southern Fried, and I have to say, it changed my whole perspective on what chicken and waffles could be." It was the wrong thing to say. Alessia's scoff was audible. "Oh, so you're on a tour of authentic black culture. How exotic for you." "Alessia Marie," their mother warned from the doorway. "No, Mama, let's be real about this." Alessia turned to face her sister. "This is what you left the community for, some rich white lawyer who probably thinks eating soul food makes him down." "That's not fair," Gaynell started, but her father's voice cut through the room. "Life isn't fair, baby girl. I thought we taught you that." He sat back down, every movement deliberate. "Tell me, Mr. Bartholomew, you ever hear of the Bronzeville Coalition for Fair Housing?" "Yes, sir," Lavender replied. "They're currently fighting against the luxury development project on 43rd Street. Fighting against your law firm, you mean?" The silence that followed was deafening. Gaynell felt her heart drop. She hadn't known about this connection. "You're right," Lavender said quietly. "Whitworth, Sterling and Blake represents the developers. It's one of the reasons I've been working to expand our pro bono program, to provide legal support to community organizations fighting against displacement." "How generous," Alessia drawled, "using your privilege to help the poor black folks fight against the very system that made you rich." "That's enough," Marion interrupted. "Dinner's ready. Whatever else we are, we're still family and we'll break bread together with respect." The dining room table, scratched and marked with 30 years of family meals, had been set with the good china, the pieces Marion had collected one by one from thrift stores and estate sales. Gaynell noticed her mother had made all her childhood favorites: smothered pork chops, collard greens, mac and cheese that could make angels weep. A peace offering, maybe, or a reminder of what she might be leaving behind. The conversation over dinner was painfully polite, loaded with subtext. Every time Lavender praised the food, Alessia rolled her eyes. When he mentioned his grandmother's civil rights work, James countered with stories of friends who'd actually been on the front lines. Marion tried to mediate, asking safe questions about work and weather, but the tension remained palpable. It all came to a head when Lavender mentioned his firm's diversity initiative. "Let me guess," Alessia said, putting down her fork. "You're looking for qualified candidates who can fit into the culture of your firm?" "Actually, we're working to change the culture," Lavender responded. "The legal profession has systemic barriers that need to be dismantled, not just worked around." "And you think you're the one to do that? The privileged white savior come to rescue us?" "Alessia," Gaynell snapped, "you don't know him." "I know his type," her sister shot back. "I see them every day, gentrifying our neighborhoods, talking about urban renewal and community improvement, while pushing out families who've lived here for generations. And now you're letting one gentrify your life. That's not what this is." "Really? When's the last time you came to a community meeting? When's the last time you helped out at the youth center? Ever since you started dating him, you've been spending more time on the north side than in your own neighborhood." "I'm still me, Alessia. Loving him doesn't change that." The word loving fell into the room like a stone into still water. Marion dropped her fork. James's face hardened. Alessia pushed back from the table. "Loving him?" she said, her voice thick with disbelief. "Girl, he doesn't love you. You're his social justice accessory, his proof that he's one of the good ones. Wait until his family finds out. Bet they'll show you exactly how much love means to people like them." Lavender stood then, his chair scraping against the hardwood. "You don't know my family, and you clearly don't want to know me, but I love your sister. Not as an accessory, not as a statement, but as the brilliant, compassionate, challenging woman she is. I know I come from privilege. I know there are things about her life and her community that I will never fully understand, but I'm here to learn, to support, to grow. And if that's not enough for you, then that's your loss." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ever-present Chicago street noise seemed muted. Ganelle reached for Lavender's hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I think," James said finally, his voice heavy with authority, "it's time for you to leave." "Daddy," Ganelle started, but he held up a hand. "Both of you. I need time to think about what's happening to my family." They left quietly, Marion hugging Ganelle briefly at the door, whispering, "Give him time, baby. Just give him time." Alessia didn't say goodbye. In the car, the silence stretched between them like a living thing. Finally, Ganelle spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." Lavender took her hand, brought it to his lips. "Don't be. They love you. They're trying to protect you, and maybe they're right to be suspicious. God knows history has given them reason. But we'll prove them wrong. Not with words, but with time and actions and love." As they drove away from the house that had shaped her, Ganelle caught a last glimpse of her father in the window, watching them go. She didn't know then that it would be months before she spoke to him again, that this dinner would become a line in the sand, a moment that would test not just her relationship with Lavender, but her entire understanding of love, family, and identity. The Chicago night enveloped them, the city lights blurring through tears she refused to let fall. Sometimes, she would later write in her journal, "Love requires you to disappoint the people who taught you what love means. The trick is holding on to both loves until everyone learns to make room for both. Love prevails." The weeks following the disastrous family dinner unfolded like autumn leaves, each day bringing new challenges and unexpected beauty. Ganelle threw herself into her work at the legal aid clinic, while Lavender's pro bono hours mysteriously doubled. They were both running from the pain, but somehow always running toward each other. Their love story wrote itself in small moments. Stolen lunches in the clinic's break room, where Lavender learned to love the spicy noodles from the Vietnamese place around the corner, weekend mornings at small black-owned bookstores where Ganelle would recommend authors who had shaped her worldview, and Lavender would sit for hours, absorbing James Baldwin and Toni Morrison with the same intensity he usually reserved for legal briefs. One rainy Sunday, they found themselves at the DuSable Black History Museum. Lavender stood before an exhibit about the Great Migration, studying a photograph of a black family arriving in Chicago, their faces full of hope and determination. "My great-grandparents looked just like this," Ganelle said, softly, standing beside him. "They came up from Mississippi with nothing but faith and grit." Lavender took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Tell me about them." And so she did, right there in the museum, sharing stories of her great-grandmother's famous sweet potato pie recipe that had helped pay for their first apartment, of her great-grandfather's job at the stockyards, of family legends and struggles and triumphs. Lavender listened with the same respect he showed in court, asking questions that showed he wasn't just hearing the words, but understanding the legacy they carried. It was that day, watching him engage so genuinely with her history, that Ganelle felt something shift inside her. The love she'd been cautiously nurturing bloomed fully, undeniable as sunrise. Their commitment to change manifested in concrete ways. Lavender restructured his firm's internship program, creating paid positions specifically for students from underserved communities. Ganel expanded the clinic's services, using resources Lavender helped secure to add evening hours for working clients. Together, they were building something new, a bridge between their worlds that others could cross. The breakthrough with Lavender's family came unexpectedly. His mother, Catherine Bartholomew, showed up at the clinic one afternoon, pearls and privilege seemingly out of place in the waiting room. Ganel braced herself for confrontation, but instead found an ally. "I've been watching the work you two are doing," Catherine said over coffee in Ganel's office. "It reminds me of my mother-in-law, Martha. She always said love was an action word." She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a small velvet box. This was hers. She would have wanted you to have it. Inside was a vintage sapphire ring, its deep blue stone surrounded by tiny diamonds. "She wore it to every civil rights meeting," Catherine explained, "said it reminded her that beauty could come from struggle." That evening, when Ganel showed the ring to Lavender, he cried. "Grandma Martha would have loved you," he said. "She always told me to find someone who would make me brave." The ring became a symbol of their defiance against prejudice, a reminder that love could bridge the deepest divides. Ganel wore it on a chain around her neck, close to her heart. Their relationship deepened through challenges. When one of Lavender's colleagues made a racially insensitive comment at a firm dinner, Lavender didn't just change the subject. He called it out, risking professional discomfort to stand for what was right. When Ganel's favorite client lost her housing appeal, Lavender spent entire weekends helping her research alternatives, learning firsthand about the housing discrimination his own profession often enabled. They learned to navigate cultural differences with grace and humor. Lavender's first time at a black church service with Ganel's aunt left him bewildered but moved. Ganel's introduction to sailing with Lavender's college friends became a lesson in claiming space in unfamiliar territories. Each experience added another layer to their understanding of each other's worlds. Their love wasn't just surviving the opposition, it was thriving because of it. Every challenge forced them to communicate more deeply, to understand each other more fully. They weren't just crossing the bridges between their worlds, they were building new ones. One evening, as they walked along Lake Michigan, Lavender stopped suddenly. "You know what I realized," he said, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold. "Everyone who doubted us did us a favor. They made us prove our love wasn't just emotion, it's a choice we make every day, a commitment to understanding, to growth, to standing together even when it's hard." Ganel looked at him, this man who had learned to see the world through her eyes, even as he helped her see it through his. "Love prevails," she said simply, "not because it's easy, but because we make it prevail." That night, they began planning their wedding, not a grand society affair or a traditional family celebration, but something uniquely their own. They would create a ceremony that honored both their backgrounds while celebrating the new culture they had created together, one built on understanding, respect, and the kind of love that changes not just two people, but everyone around them. Their love had prevailed not by ignoring the obstacles, but by facing them together. Each challenge had strengthened their bond. Each criticism had deepened their commitment. They were writing a new kind of love story, one that proved that hearts could grow large enough to hold different worlds, that love could build bridges stronger than prejudice, that two people could choose each other every day and make that choice mean something more than just emotion. They could make it mean change. As the lake breeze carried the promise of summer, Ganel and Lavender walked hand in hand, their shadows merging in the fading light. They had learned that love prevails not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through daily choices, constant growth, and the courage to keep choosing each other, even when, especially when, the world questioned their choice. The wedding they didn't attend. The morning of October 15th dawned with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that seemed designed for new beginnings. The Chicago Botanic Gardens Rose Garden, where Guinel and Lavender had chosen to exchange their vows, was ablaze with late-blooming flowers, their petals catching the early morning light like nature's own confetti. Guinel stood before the vintage mirror in her bridal suite, surrounded by friends who had become family when her own family chose absence. The wedding dress, a masterpiece from a black designer in Brooklyn, told its own story of fusion. Classic silhouette meets African inspiration with intricate beadwork that echoed the patterns of her grandmother's favorite kente cloth. "Your mama should be here," whispered Teresa, her best friend since college, and now her maid of honor. They all should. The empty chairs would speak volumes later, 4 seats in the front row, reserved but untouched. James and Marion Blossom's absence would echo in the space they should have filled. Alessia's empty spot would ache like a phantom limb. But Guinel had learned that sometimes love meant moving forward even when pieces of your heart stayed behind. The invitation responses, or lack thereof, had arrived like body blows over the past months. Her father's had come first, a formally written note. "I cannot support this union. I hope one day you'll understand why." Her mother had called, tears in her voice. "Baby, I want to be there, but your daddy, I can't go against him on this." Alessia's response had been digital, a text message that read simply, "You're making a mistake. I won't watch you make it." But for every family member who chose not to attend, someone else stepped forward to fill the void. Catherine Bartholomew had become the mother figure Guinel desperately needed during wedding planning, showing up with wedding magazines and tea, listening without judgment, sharing stories of her own marriage's early struggles with cultural differences. The morning unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Guinel's old clients from the legal aid clinic arrived early, dressed in their Sunday best, bearing covered dishes for the reception, their way of blessing the union. They filled the seats left empty by family, bringing with them the love and support of a community that had watched this unlikely romance blossom. In another suite across the garden, Lavender prepared with his groomsmen, including Thomas, a partner from his firm who had become his strongest ally in changing corporate culture. His bow tie was African mud cloth, a gift from one of Guinel's aunts who had broken ranks to support them. His cufflinks had belonged to his grandmother Martha, a tangible reminder of the woman who had taught him that love required courage. The ceremony space was a testament to their journey. White garden chairs lined with African print runners, classical music blending seamlessly with jazz, programs printed in both English and Twi, honoring Guinel's Ghanaian heritage. Each detail had been chosen to represent not just their union, but the bridging of their worlds. As the guests began to arrive, filling the garden with a vibrant mix of corporate lawyers and community activists, professors and clients, society friends and grassroots organizers, the absence of Guinel's family became a presence of its own. The empty front row seats stood as silent witnesses to the cost of their love. But then something unexpected happened. Just before the ceremony was to begin, Marion Blossom's best friend, Miss Ruby, arrived, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Your mama wanted you to have this," she said, pressing it into Guinel's hands. "She couldn't come herself, but she stayed up all night making it." Inside was a handkerchief, hand-embroidered with the date and their names, surrounded by tiny roses. In the corner, in Marion's precise stitching, "Love knows no boundaries." Guinel pressed it to her heart, letting her mother's love reach across the divide. The ceremony itself became a celebration not just of their love, but of the community they had built together. Judge Martinez, who had watched their relationship develop through their work at the legal aid clinic, officiated. Their vows, written together over late-night conversations, spoke not just of love, but of commitment to justice, to understanding, to growing together through challenge. "I choose you," Lavender said, his voice carrying across the garden, "not despite our differences, but because of how they have helped us both grow. I promise to keep learning, to keep listening, to keep working towards the kind of world where love like ours isn't seen as an exception, but as a beautiful possibility." Gainel's vows, spoken through tears of both joy and grief, acknowledged the cost and triumph of their choice. "I choose you, knowing that choice comes with loss, but believing that what we're building together is worth every painful step. I promise to keep choosing you, to keep building bridges, to keep believing that love can transform not just us, but the world around us." When Judge Martinez pronounced them married, the garden erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the autumn leaves from their branches. The empty chairs in the front row seemed less noticeable now, overshadowed by the fullness of love that surrounded them. The reception became a testament to the world they were creating together. Corporate lawyers dancing to soul music, community activists sharing wine with society matrons, barriers breaking down one conversation at a time. Catherine Bartholomew was seen deep in conversation with Miss Ruby about civil rights history. Thomas, the law firm partner, ended up in an intense discussion about educational reform with one of Gainel's former clients. As evening fell and garden lights twinkled like earthbound stars, Gainel and Lavender shared their first dance to Sam Cooke's "A Change Is Gonna Come." They moved together under the October sky, their shadows merging into one on the dance floor. "Look around," Lavender whispered, holding her close. "This is our family now, not by blood but by choice. Every person here chose to stand with us, to believe in us." Gainel rested her head on his shoulder, her mother's handkerchief tucked safely in her bodice. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the family you build is as important as the family you're born into." Later that night, after the last guest had gone and the garden was quiet except for the rustle of autumn leaves, they stood together looking at the empty chairs in the front row. Lavender wrapped his arms around his wife, and together they held the space for both joy and sorrow, for endings and beginnings, for the complex beauty of a love that dared to cross boundaries. The next morning, they would find a voicemail from Marion Blossom, her voice thick with tears. "The pictures Miss Ruby sent. You looked so beautiful, baby. So happy. Maybe we were wrong." It wasn't forgiveness yet or acceptance, but it was a start. Like the late roses still blooming in the October garden, it was proof that love could flower even in unlikely seasons, that bridges could be built even across the widest divides, that sometimes the hardest paths led to the most beautiful destinations. The empty chairs at their wedding became not just symbols of absence, but testimonies to the cost and courage of true love, a love strong enough to weather disapproval, bridge divides, and create its own kind of family. They stood as reminders that sometimes the most powerful love stories are written not in the presence of family, but in the spaces they leave behind, in the new connections forged, in the courage to choose love, even when that choice comes with loss. Years of growth. 5 years passed, like pages turning in a well-loved book, each chapter bringing new challenges and triumphs for Gainel and Lavender Bartholomew. Their penthouse apartment in South Loop became a symbol of their success in bridging worlds. African art hung beside modernist paintings, law books shared shelf space with works by Zora Neale Hurston and James Baldwin, and their dinner table regularly hosted guests from every walk of life. The transformation began with their professional lives. Gainel's work at the legal aid clinic expanded beyond what anyone had imagined possible. With Lavender's connections and their shared vision, they established the Bartholomew Blossom Initiative for Community Justice, a foundation that provided not just legal aid, but comprehensive support for families fighting displacement and discrimination. Their first major victory came in the spring after their wedding. The development project that had once put Lavender's firm at odds with Gaynell's community was completely reimagined. Instead of luxury condos displacing long-time residents, the project became a mixed-income housing development with dedicated space for black-owned businesses and a community centre. "This is what change looks like," Gaynell told a room full of community leaders and corporate investors at the groundbreaking ceremony. "Not top-down charity, but collaborative growth that honours both progress and preservation." Lavender, meanwhile, rose to become the youngest partner at his firm, using his position to institute radical changes in hiring and mentorship. The firm's internship program, once a pipeline for privileged legacies, now actively recruited from historically black colleges and universities. More importantly, the program provided not just opportunity, but genuine support, mentorship, cultural competency training for existing staff, and a commitment to creating an environment where diverse voices could thrive. Their personal growth paralleled their professional success. Lavender immersed himself in black history and culture not as a tourist, but as someone committed to genuine understanding. He joined Gaynell at church sometimes, learned to play bid whist with her cousins, those who would still speak to them, and became a regular at community meetings. His presence was no longer seen as intrusion, but as authentic participation. Gaynell, for her part, learned to navigate the upper echelons of Chicago society without compromising her identity. She joined several prestigious boards, bringing her perspective on social justice to institutions that desperately needed it. At charity galas and society functions, she became known not as Lavender's black wife, but as a force for change in her own right. Their home became a gathering place for what they called their chosen family. Sunday dinners regularly featured an eclectic mix of guests, corporate lawyers breaking bread with community organizers, society matrons engaging in deep discussions with grassroots activists. These gatherings became known for their honest conversations about race, class, and change. One such evening stood out in particular. They had hosted a discussion about educational equity, bringing together teachers, administrators, and potential donors. As the conversation turned to the role of privilege in perpetuating inequality, an older white donor began to get defensive. "I just don't see why we have to keep talking about race," he said. "Isn't success just about working hard?" The room tensed, but Lavender stepped forward. "Let me tell you about my journey," he said, and proceeded to share how his relationship with Gaynell had opened his eyes to his own blind spots and privileges. His honesty transformed what could have been a confrontation into a moment of genuine learning. Their marriage became a template for others in similar relationships, showing how love could bridge divides without erasing differences. They started a support group for interracial couples, providing a space for honest discussions about the challenges and joys of crossing cultural boundaries. The years also brought personal challenges that tested their growth. When Lavender's father died unexpectedly, Gaynell stood strong beside him, helping him navigate grief while managing the family's expectations about inheritance and legacy. She encouraged him to use part of his inheritance to establish a scholarship fund for first-generation law students, turning loss into opportunity. Their inability to conceive tested them in different ways. After 2 years of trying and multiple fertility treatments, they had to confront difficult questions about family, identity, and heritage. The experience deepened their commitment to supporting children in their community, leading them to establish mentorship programs and educational initiatives. Through it all, their love continued to grow and evolve. They learned to fight fairly, to disagree respectfully, to challenge each other's assumptions while supporting each other's dreams. Their differences became strengths rather than obstacles, allowing them to approach problems from multiple perspectives. Their 5th anniversary celebration became a testament to their growth. Instead of an elaborate party, they organized a community festival in Bronzeville, bringing together all the various parts of their world. The event featured local artists and musicians, legal aid workshops, and educational programs about community development. The festival's success highlighted how far they'd come. Corporate sponsors worked alongside community organizations, society friends mingled with local residents, and the boundaries between their worlds became increasingly blurred. That evening, as they watched the sunset from their balcony, Gaynell reflected on their journey. "Remember when everyone said we were too different to make it work?" Lavender pulled her close, his chin resting on her shoulder. "We didn't just make it work. We made it matter." Their growth hadn't just been personal. It had created ripples of change throughout their communities. Their love story had become a catalyst for broader social transformation, proving that meaningful change could start with two people choosing to grow together. The years had taught them that growth wasn't just about overcoming differences, but about leveraging them for positive change. Their marriage had become a living testament to the power of love to transform not just individuals, but entire communities. As they looked out over the city they'd helped reshape, they knew their story was still being written. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities for growth, new chances to prove that love could build bridges strong enough to carry whole communities forward. 5 years, Gaynell mused, and we're just getting started. Lavender squeezed her hand, both of them knowing that their greatest growth lay not in what they'd already achieved, but in what they would continue to build together. A legacy of love that transcended boundaries and transformed lives. A sister's revelation. One rainy evening, as the city buzzed under a cascade of steady drizzle, there was an unexpected knock at Gaynell and Lavender's door. It was nearly 8, and the two of them had just settled into their usual routine of unwinding after a long day. Lavender with a legal brief, Gaynell scrolling through updates from the Bartholomew Blossom Initiative. "Expecting anyone?" Lavender asked, setting aside his reading. "No," Gaynell replied, rising from the couch. "Probably one of the neighbors." When she opened the door, she froze. Alessia stood on the threshold, soaked to the bone, her raincoat clinging to her, strands of her usually perfect curls plastered to her face. But it wasn't her appearance that shocked Gaynell. It was the tears streaming freely down her sister's cheeks. "Alessia." Gaynell's voice wavered between surprise and concern. "I was wrong," Alessia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I was so wrong." Before Gaynell could respond, Alessia stepped forward, wrapping her sister in a tight embrace. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the rain falling softly behind them, their shared history flooding the space between them. Lavender appeared in the hallway, concern etched across his face. "Is everything all right?" Alessia pulled back slightly, glancing at him with a look that held both remorse and gratitude. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice faltering. "Of course," Gaynell said, leading her inside and helping her shed her wet coat. Lavender retrieved a towel, offering it wordlessly, and Alessia accepted it with a small nod of thanks. Once seated at their kitchen table, a warm cup of tea cradled in her hands, Alessia took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "I owe you both an apology," she began, her eyes darting between her sister and brother-in-law. "For everything." Gaynell didn't rush her, instead leaning forward with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and compassion. Lavender, too, remained quiet, his presence unobtrusive but steady. "I've been watching you two from afar," Alessia continued, her voice trembling, "through social media, through the community, and through Mom and Dad, even if they don't realize it. And what I've seen, it's opened my eyes." She paused, gripping her mug tightly. "I was so angry back then. Angry at the world, at gentrification, at the systems that keep us struggling. And when you brought Lavender into the picture, I thought you'd abandoned us, abandoned everything we stood for, everything we fought for. But I didn't abandon anyone," Gaynell interjected softly, her tone more pained than defensive. Alessia nodded, her tears welling again. I see that now. Watching you two, I see what true love looks like. I see how you've bridged worlds, how you've used your relationship not to escape our community, but to uplift it. And I see how wrong I was to judge you. She turned to Lavender, her gaze steady despite the tears. I judged you too. I didn't give you a chance to show me who you really are. I let my assumptions, my own pain, blind me. But you've proved me wrong in every way. You didn't come here to save Gaynell or anyone else. You came to build something with her, something real and transformative. And you've done it. Lavender, caught off guard by her sincerity, offered a small, genuine smile. Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know. Alessia wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. I've spent so much time angry at you, at myself, at the world, but that anger didn't protect me. It just kept me from seeing the beauty of what you've built. Gaynell reached across the table, placing her hand over Alessia's. We missed you, she said simply. I missed you. I missed you too, Alessia replied, her voice breaking. I missed my big sister, and I'm so sorry for the hurt I caused you. They embraced again, this time joined by Lavender, who placed a reassuring hand on Alessia's shoulder. It was a moment of catharsis, a crack in the wall that had kept them apart for so long. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to lighter topics. Memories of childhood mischief, Alessia's students and their antics, Lavender's growing knowledge of black culture thanks to Gaynell's patient guidance. The tension that had once defined their relationship seemed to melt away, replaced by the easy warmth of family. Before Alessia left, she hesitated at the door, looking between them with a hint of nervousness. Do you think Mom and Dad might come around too, one day? Gaynell's expression softened. I hope so, but it might take time. And patience, Lavender added, but if tonight's any indication, I'd say we're moving in the right direction. Alessia nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. Thank you for not giving up on me. As she stepped out into the now clear night, Gaynell and Lavender stood together in the doorway, watching her walk down the street. The air felt lighter, as if a long-standing weight had finally been lifted. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Lavender turned to Gaynell. Do you think this is the start of something new with your family? Gaynell smiled, her heart full of cautious hope. I think it's the start of healing, and that's enough for now. With Alessia's revelation, a new chapter in their journey began. One of reconciliation, growth, and the possibility of building a bridge not just between two worlds, but within the family that had once seemed irreparably divided. It was a reminder that love, when nurtured and steadfast, could inspire even the hardest hearts to soften and see the truth. The family reunites. The late summer sun bathed the garden venue in a golden glow, casting a soft, dreamlike light over the carefully arranged chairs, blooming floral arches, and elegantly dressed guests. Alessia's wedding was a sight to behold, a perfect blend of her fiery personality and meticulous attention to detail. It was a day Gaynell had dreamt of for years, though she'd once feared her place in it would remain uncertain. Now, as Gaynell adjusted her lavender maid-of-honor dress and prepared to walk down the aisle, she felt a mix of pride, relief, and overwhelming gratitude. It had taken years to get here, years of misunderstandings, hard conversations, and slow reconciliation. Yet here they were, standing as family once again. Lavender, seated in the front row with a radiant smile, gave her a small wave. The man who had once been a source of division had become the glue holding the family together. Beside him, James and Marion Blossom sat, their faces alight with pride and joy. Their journey toward acceptance had not been quick or easy, but in the end, love had won. The journey to reconciliation. The months following Alessia's emotional visit to Gainel and Lavender's home had been marked by incremental healing. Alessia had become a bridge between her parents and Gainel, gently nudging their stubborn hearts toward understanding. She brought stories of Gainel and Lavender's work, emphasizing the impact they were making in their community. "It's not about leaving us behind," Alessia had told their father during one of their long conversations over coffee. "It's about expanding what family means. They're doing what we've always talked about, using their love to make a difference." James Blossom, ever the stoic patriarch, had listened in silence, but his actions spoke louder than words. He began asking Alessia to share updates about Gainel, subtly shifting his perspective. Marion, torn between loyalty to her husband and longing to reconnect with her eldest daughter, began making small overtures, a birthday card here, a phone call there. Each step felt like a victory to Gainel, who was learning to be patient with the process. It was Alessia's engagement announcement that finally shifted the dynamic. When she invited Gainel and Lavender to her engagement dinner, the tension in the air was palpable. Gainel hesitated before accepting, unsure if her parents were truly ready to face her husband. The dinner was awkward but civil. James and Marion exchanged polite conversation with Lavender, their discomfort evident but tempered by Alessia's unwavering insistence that everyone act as family. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The turning point came months later when Marion visited Gainel and Lavender's apartment unannounced. She arrived with a casserole and an apology, her hands trembling as she admitted how much she'd missed her daughter. "I've been afraid," Marion confessed, tears streaming down her face. "Afraid of losing you, afraid of what people would think. But I see now that I was wrong. Lavender loves you. That's all that matters." From that day forward, the walls began to crumble. James, though slower to come around, eventually followed his wife's lead. A chance encounter with one of Lavender's pro bono clients at a community event left James impressed by the young lawyer's sincerity and dedication. He began to see Lavender not as a symbol of privilege, but as a man committed to justice and equality. The wedding day. Now, as Alessia prepared to walk down the aisle, Gainel stood by her sister's side, her heart swelling with emotion. She watched as their father, proud and steady, took Alessia's arm to escort her down the aisle. The image of James Blossom, a man who had once stood so firmly against Lavender's inclusion in their family, now walking with his daughter toward a future filled with love, was almost too much for Gainel to bear. The ceremony was beautiful, a reflection of Alessia and her fiancé's shared values. They had chosen a venue that honored their roots, a historic garden in the heart of Bronzeville, surrounded by the community that had shaped them both. The officiant spoke of unity and resilience, weaving in themes of family and forgiveness that resonated deeply with everyone present. Lavender, seated beside Marion and James, beamed with pride as Gainel stood proudly at her sister's side. His quiet strength and unwavering support had become a cornerstone of the Blossom family's healing. Marion, who had once been so hesitant to accept him, now leaned over to squeeze his hand, a silent gesture of gratitude and acknowledgement. When it came time for the maid of honor's speech, Gainel stood before the gathered guests, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. She spoke of Alessia's fiery spirit, her dedication to justice, and her unwavering loyalty. "Alessia has always been my compass," Gainel said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "She challenges me, inspires me, and reminds me of where I come from. Watching her marry the love of her life today is a privilege I will cherish forever." Her gaze shifted briefly to Lavender, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Love isn't always easy," she continued. "Sometimes it's messy and complicated, But when it's real, it's worth every struggle, every sacrifice. Alessia and Marcus, your love reminds us all that the hardest paths often lead to the most beautiful destinations. The applause was thunderous, but the most meaningful reaction came later, when James approached her during the reception. His usually reserved demeanor softened as he took her hand. "I'm proud of you, baby girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I see now what I couldn't see before. You've built something beautiful with Lavender, and I was wrong not to see that sooner." Ganelle felt tears spill over as she embraced her father. It was a moment she had dreamed of, but never thought she would experience. A new beginning. As the evening wore on, the dance floor became a celebration of unity. Lavender twirled Marion to a lively jazz tune, their laughter carrying over the music. James shared a quiet dance with Alessia, their bond as strong as ever. And Ganelle, watching it all from the sidelines, felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Later that night, as she and Lavender sat together under the stars, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "I never thought we'd see this day," she admitted, leaning her head on his shoulder. Lavender wrapped an arm around her, his smile soft and genuine. "It was always possible. Love has a way of breaking through even the hardest barriers." As Ganelle watched her family laugh and dance together, she realized that the path they had walked, though fraught with pain and difficulty, had been worth it. The reunion was more than a moment. It was a testament to the transformative power of love, patience, and perseverance. Alessia's wedding marked not just a union of two souls, but the reunion of a family once divided. And as Ganelle sat surrounded by the people she loved most, she knew with certainty that the hardest paths truly did lead to the most beautiful destinations.